Chapter 13. Homesteading This Dry Land, 1905 to 1920. The Big Picture. The homesteading era lasted just a few years, but changed much of Montana's landscape. Homesteaders endured great hardship, learned to live with the land, and struggled to better understand their new home. Some of the funniest, saddest, hardest, most optimistic, most tragic, and just plain good stories about Montana happened during the homestead era. The homesteading boom was a time like no other in Montana. Rain turned the whole state into a great green paradise. The railroads advertised Montana farmland to the world, and the federal government gave it away, 32 million acres of it, for free. In just a few years, more than 82,000 homesteaders moved to Montana. Some came to build a life. Others hoped to make money for a few years, sell the place, and move on. They were young men, families, single women, and children, lots of children. They poured in on the railroads by the hundreds every day. Miners and cowboys called them honeyhawkers, which is chicken chasers, scissorbills, and sodbusters, insults that reflected resentment against the hordes of newcomers. There seemed to be endless numbers of them. Most of these newcomers misunderstood Montana's land and climate. They did not know that years of rain in Montana quickly cycled back into years of drought. Just a few short years after the homestead boom began, the rains stopped. Montana's plains returned to their normal dry, wind-swept conditions. Soils dried up and cracked like calluses. Winds blew the topsoil away. Swarms of grasshoppers devoured crops. The homesteaders' hope and optimism turned to grief and despair. Many left their farms and moved on, searching for better opportunities. Some stayed. The homestead years transformed Montana. The great land grab brought the end of any sense of frontier. The homesteaders' plows ruined the native grasslands. Homesteaders hunted game animals, like deer, elk, and antelope, until they nearly disappeared. Towns, counties, and state government changed shape as different forces pushed communities and pulled them apart. The struggle to survive deeply affected the character of Montana itself. The main character, the land. The land itself is the main character in most Montana story. Many different factors combine to make good farmland. Precipitation,
rain and snow,
and the number of streams and water sources affect how dry the soil is. Wind and heat can dry out soil too. Topography,
the arrangement of hills, mountains, and slopes.
Latitude,
distance north or south from the equator.
And altitude all affect exposure to sunlight and length of the growing season. Each of Montana's 3 geographic regions has a different mixture of all these factors. Yet compared to the Midwest, all of Montana is dry. If you had looked down on the United States from space in 1900, you would have seen a line running north to south right down the middle of North and South Dakota. East of this line, you would have seen the green farmlands of the Midwest. West of the line, you would have seen dry, open plains. This line, located at about the 98th meridian, which is a line of longitude, is sometimes called the rainfall line. It divides the moist Midwest from the semi-arid,
dry
West. It is so dry in eastern and central Montana and in the western Dakotas that the small 160-acre farms of the Midwest and the East could not grow enough crops to support a family here. Early farms fed forts and mining camps. People have cultivated plants since the dawn of human history. In the place now called Montana, many Indian bands harvested plants for food and medicine as part of their seasonal rounds of activities. Fur traders, missionaries, and early settlers also cultivated crops when they arrived. Farms spread into the Deer Lodge, Gallatin, and Madison valleys. Farmers grew food for the miners and townspeople and hay for their horses. They produced wheat, oats, barley, garden vegetables, and fruit trees. They also raised horses, cattle, hogs, and chickens. By the 1880s, farms peppered the mountain valleys on either side of the Continental Divide. A few farmers had spread into the Prickly Pear Valley near Helena and along the Sun River west of Great Falls. Very few farms lay to the east. In Choteau County, which is around Fort Benton, there were only 4 farms. In eastern Montana, close to Fort Peck, there was only 1. It took changes to the nation's homesteading laws and several other factors to attract farmers to eastern Montana. 1862. Homesteaders take up the Midwest. President Thomas Jefferson, who supervised the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, did not want America to fill up with large industrial cities. He strongly believed that America should be a nation of small independent farmers who were educated and virtuous and who owned their own land. It became part of federal policy to open up land for settlers and farmers, often removing Indian tribes in the process. In 1862, Congress passed the first Homestead Act. It allowed citizens to claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. To gain full title to the land, they had to prove up, which is fulfilling certain obligations for land ownership, by building a house, planting crops, and staying on the land for 5 years. Once a homesteader proved up on a homestead claim and paid a small filing fee, he or she owned the land. Between 1862 and 1986, which is when homesteading ended in the United States, 2 million homesteaders swept into the Midwest and the West. Fewer than half of them were able to prove up and claim full title,
legal ownership,
to their land. Still, in the 124 years of homesteading in the United States, 270 million acres, 10% of the continental United States, transferred into private ownership. But the driest lands, like most of Montana for example, did not attract homesteaders until after 1900. Politics, the economy, and weather worked together. In the early 1900s, Congress passed several laws to make homesteading in the dry West more attractive. In 1902, it passed the Reclamation Act, which funded many irrigation projects across the West to supply water to farms. It was called reclamation because people thought that by creating productive farmland through irrigation, they were reclaiming,
converting to usable land,
a wasteland. In Montana, the Reclamation Act helped build the Huntley Project east of Billings, the Lower Yellowstone Project near the Montana-Dakota state line, the Milk River Project in northern Montana, and the Sun River Project west of Great Falls. In 1906, the Forest Homestead Act opened up lands within the national forests for homesteading if they had agricultural value. In 1909, the enlarged Homestead Act increased the size of a homestead to 320 acres. The original 160 acres may have been large enough to support a family in the rain-soaked East, but it was far too small in the dry West. Homesteaders would soon find out that even a 360-acre farm was too small. In 1912, Congress reduced the amount of time homesteaders had to live on their farm to prove up, from 5 years to 3 years. And in 1916, the Stock Raising Homestead Act increased the maximum homestead claim to 640 acres of grazing land in areas not suitable for irrigation. Allotments bring homesteaders to the reservations. Homesteading had a huge effect on Montana's Indian lands, especially the Flathead and Fort Peck reservations. The Dawes Act of 1887 gave Congress the power to survey reservation lands,
land that tribes had reserved for their own use through treaties,
assign allotments or tracts of land to individual tribal members, and open up the remaining lands for homesteading by non-Indians.
See Chapter 11.
Most allotments did not happen in Montana until after 1900. Between 1908 and 1926, the Flathead, Fort Peck, and Blackfeet reservations together lost millions of acres of tribal land. Homesteaders surged onto the reservations to claim these lands. One goal of allotment was to open up reservation lands to homesteaders. A second goal was to surround American Indians with white farmers who would demonstrate a successful farming lifestyle. The idea was that this would help Indians assimilate,
be absorbed into the majority culture.
With homesteaders came roads, telephones, and motorized transportation that made some reservations less isolated. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation had not been allotted,
Divided up.
but there was a plan to abolish
Put an end to.
the reservation and move the Northern Cheyenne onto the Crow Reservation. Homesteaders simply settled onto Northern Cheyenne lands, expecting to gain ownership. A burst of new immigrants. Upheaval in Europe drove many Northern Europeans to immigrate to America between 1880 and 1914. Germans, Swedes, Norwegians, Scandinavians, and other Europeans left the economic and political uncertainty of their homelands and came to America. Many took jobs in factories, contributing to the explosive growth of cities at this time. People in these growing cities needed to eat. They created a huge demand for agricultural products. Many of the new European immigrants bypassed the cities and crowded farmlands farther east and looked to the newly opened West. They found much of the northern United States similar to the landscape back home. By 1910, more than half of all Montanans were either immigrants or first-generation Americans. Many of these new Montanans were homesteaders. Meanwhile, America was enjoying a period of national prosperity. Lowered interest rates made it easier for people to get loans to set up farms. The beginning of World War I in Europe, 1914, created a sudden boom in the world's market for agricultural products. Armies needed to eat. Prices rose sky high. There was also a sudden demand for metals, so Montana's mining towns expanded. The region's agricultural products gained a vast new market. Railroads promote free tickets to paradise. By 1908, the Milwaukee Road and the Great Northern Railway had both completed their transcontinental
All the way across the continent.
lines across Montana.
See Chapter 9.
Unlike the Northern Pacific, neither of these railroads had received land grants, free land that the federal government gives to a company, an organization, or a state. So, they needed to make their money from passengers and freight. They needed people to settle in Montana who would pay to travel, import goods and supplies, and raise grain to ship to eastern markets. The Milwaukee Road began aggressively marketing the land along its railroad line, especially the Musselshell Valley and the Judith Basin, as a golden opportunity for farmers. It published posters, brochures, and ads portraying Montana as green, fertile farmland. But no one promoted Montana homesteading more than James J. Hill. By this time, Hill owned the Great Northern and much of the Northern Pacific, too. Hill sponsored dryland
Without irrigation.
farming conferences and exhibitions. He offered prizes for crops and livestock. He sent special trains displaying Montana's agricultural products around the country to advertise farmland along the High Line. Hill distributed brochures and flyers across the country and in Europe, encouraging emigration and always emphasizing, quote, Montana's free homesteads. Most importantly, he offered special fares across the Atlantic and cheap train fare to transport homesteaders and their families, stock, and belongings to their new homes in Montana. The federal and state governments, local chambers of commerce, and other groups also published ads and flyers promoting free land in Montana. They sponsored contests for the biggest and best crops and livestock, then advertised those prize winners as average Montana products. These promotions were just as effective as ads for cars and electronics are today. They made people long for the good life on a fertile Montana farm. New ways to cultivate the dry land. Some people thought that if irrigation could not turn Montana into a moist paradise, perhaps new farming techniques could. Farmers in other dry regions developed dryland farming methods. One of them was Hardy Webster Campbell from North Dakota. He noticed that thick green grass grew in the ruts of roads where wagon wheels compacted the soil. He also noticed that plants grew wherever the last snowdrifts of spring trickled moisture into the soil. From these observations, he developed his own farming methods. Campbell promoted subsurface compacting, compressing the soil beneath the surface. This was a method of plowing that firmly packed the loose soil at the bottom of a furrow so that it would hold water at the level where roots develop. Then Campbell recommended tilling up the top 2 to 3 inches of soil into a loose, dry layer of mulch to prevent moisture from evaporating. Campbell believed that climate conditions had little effect on crops. In fact, he thought rain drained the soil of its fertility. He thought that manipulating the soil was the key to farming in the West. Agricultural researchers at Montana Agricultural College, now Montana State University, cautioned against Campbell's system. They feared it would damage the topsoil. But the boosters, people who vigorously promote something, dismissed their pessimism. The homesteaders listened to the boosters. It was hard not to. The weather cooperated. The homestead boom never would have happened without rain. Just as the government's promotional campaign began, the northern plains entered a wet, rainy period. Places that averaged 7 to 9 inches of rain per year began to get 15 inches, even 18 inches. Rains fell heaviest in May and June, just in time to saturate the soil and nourish new crops. The plains sprouted into lush growth. The land seemed to be living up to the advertising slogans. People even began to believe that farming itself was helping transform the climate of the northern plains, converting it to a green paradise. Montana's plains region has always experienced alternating wet and dry periods lasting 3 to 30 years. This wet cycle lasted from 1909 to 1917, just long enough to lure thousands of homesteaders onto the plains. A tidal wave of arrivals. In 1909, homesteaders swept like a tidal wave across Montana. Hopeful men, women, and families poured into the state. Most came by train, and some came by car or truck. Homesteaders came from Scandinavia, Germany, and Scotland. They came from Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. Some were tenant
Renter
farmers tired of working other people's farms. They brought generations of agricultural knowledge with them. Others were bank clerks, factory workers, craftsmen, accountants, or actors who had never touched a plow. Many, in some areas up to 18%, were single or widowed women. Like the men, they came looking for opportunity. At least a few took out large loans to get a good start. Others arrived penniless. Almost all of them were young, in their 20s or 30s. Whole families moved west together, each member filing a homestead claim. Brothers and sisters filed on adjacent lands, then built their houses close together so they could share chores. At least a few husbands and wives divorced, so they could file individually and remarried when they had proven up, joining their 2 homesteads to make a large farm. New boomtowns like Redyard, Rygate, Scobie, Baker, and Hardin sprang up almost overnight. On one springtime evening in Havre, the Great Northern Railway unloaded 250 homesteading families from a single train. On one springtime evening in Havre, the Great Northern Railway unloaded 250 homesteading families from a single train. Between 1909 and 1919, more than 82,000 homesteaders filed claims on 25 million acres of land in Montana. This is more land than Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Rhode Island combined. In 1910, the Great Falls Land Office, which served north-central Montana, processed between 1,000 and 1,500 homestead filings every month. The homestead boom happened all across the West, but more people claimed more land in Montana than anywhere else. Starting out. Once here, the hopeful newcomers selected land, filed their claims, and set about the business of building a new life. First, they had to find water, build homes and livestock sheds, stockpile firewood, plant gardens for their own food, and line out fences. Then they started their most important task, getting in a first-year crop, usually flax, which grew well on newly turned sod. They built houses of rough planks insulated along the bottom with rocks or sod. They stuffed newspaper or straw between the boards to keep the wind out. Sometimes their shacks blew over in a winter gale. Families huddled around little stoves that burned twisted straw, cow chips, or coal carried from the railroad yard or mined from nearby coal veins. A few homesteaders' houses had second stories, wood floors, and glass windows, but not many. Lucky homesteaders found good ground on creeks with timber nearby, but thousands of others arrived to a land dry and rocky, totally unlike the golden wheat fields pictured in the promotional brochures. They faced a constant struggle for water and firewood. Children learned to work almost as soon as they could walk. They fed the chickens and pigs, milked cows, collected eggs, chopped firewood, hauled water, and helped deliver produce to town by horseback or wagon. As they grew, they took on more responsibilities, helping repair fences, harvest crops, build barns, and operate farm equipment. Women held the homestead together. A woman on the homestead cleaned, cooked, washed, tended the family garden, fed and managed the livestock, helped in the fields, trained horses, and worked alongside, and often without, men. At harvest time, she cooked 3 huge meals a day for threshing,
separating wheat from straw.
Crews of 20 people. She doctored neighbors who were sick or giving birth. And to her own family, she was primary teacher, minister, doctor, and source of ingenuity and optimism. Men also worked endlessly. They dug wells, built houses, strung fences, tilled the soil, threshed wheat, cut firewood, repaired equipment, and helped neighbors. Some even played fiddle at the Saturday night dance. For some people, homesteading brought endless adventure. For others, it was a life of lonely toil. Many fathers had to leave their families in wintertime to find work on the railroad or in town. Mothers spent the winter on the farm with the kids and the livestock. Sometimes it was the women who left and spent the winter teaching school in town. Laws allowed homesteaders to be gone up to 5 months a year, so they could earn extra income. Where farms were spread far apart, people figured out ways to stay in touch. Some farmers strung telephone wire along barbed wire fences so they could keep in touch with neighbors. A visit from the postman always brought news and gossip. Mail carriers sometimes carried eggs and milk to town for the farm wives and brought back payment on their next visit. The homesteaders' optimism became one of their most powerful tools. They tackled hardship because they thought it was only temporary. They believed that a few years of hard work would bring prosperity and security. They did not listen to the old cattlemen or the state's agricultural experts who warned against expanding too fast. Pessimism had no place on the homestead. 1917 to 1918, peak of homesteading in Montana. Homesteading peaked in Montana in 1917 and 1918. In each of these years, more than 14,000 people filed for a total of 3.1 million acres of homestead land. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. The government pushed farmers to increase production to meet the market demands of the war. With slogans like "Food will win the war," the government urged homesteaders to buy more land and equipment to expand their farms. Banks encouraged farmers to borrow money to buy land, tractors, plows, threshers, and harrowers so they could work more land. Montana farmers expressed their patriotism by going further into debt. Homesteading changed Montana. The tidal wave of homesteaders broke up Montana's foothills and plains into farms and brought an end to the sense of a wide-open frontier. The landscape of the plains transformed. The free-range native grasslands became a settled and plowed landscape of cropland and grazing land, strung with fences, roads, and railroad tracks. Homesteaders built communities. Homesteaders deeply influenced social life in Montana. Neighbors arriving in an area at the same time helped one another, housed and fed one another, and took turns building one another's houses. They worked together to build schools and community halls, to improve and maintain county roads, and to set up volunteer fire departments and telephone cooperatives.
Businesses or companies owned by the people who use them.
Homesteaders often gathered at one another's houses or in town for dances, fairs, and ice cream socials. They organized multi-family picnics. A school pageant was the highlight of the season. Even those spread out across the plains conquered their isolation with a spirit of cooperation and mutual concern. They changed Montana politics. Many homesteaders held the traditional belief that women provided moral guidance to their society. They thought women could improve Montana by getting involved in political and civic affairs, so most homesteaders supported women's suffrage.
The right to vote.
In 1914, Montana tied with Nevada to become the 9th state in the Union to give women the vote. Women voters helped elect the first woman to the U.S. Congress, Jeannette Rankin from Missoula. Many women also disapproved of gambling houses, saloons, and dance halls, which were common in mining and cowboy towns. They campaigned for prohibition.
Outlawing drinking or selling alcohol. See Chapter 15.
Homesteaders also worked together to reduce the control that mining and railroad companies had over state politics. To bring local governments closer to the people, the homesteaders split up many of the large, spread-out counties into smaller ones. County seats created jobs and brought local government services like courts and filing offices closer to the people. Also, since each county elected a state senator, more rural agricultural counties gave farmers a stronger voice in the state legislature.
The branch of government that passes laws.
The bust begins. In 1917, the drought years returned. Northern counties dried up. Crops produced half their previous yield. Farmers tightened their belts, borrowed more money, and hoped for rain the next year. The next year was worse. Dry, hot winds withered crops and dried up water holes. Wind shredded tar paper shacks and blew dust into water tanks and clothing. Windstorms tore seed out of the ground and piled topsoil around the fence lines. In some places, temperatures stayed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit all summer. Drought marched south and westward. By the fall of 1918, it gripped all of eastern and central Montana. Farmers who had believed that 15 to 18 inches of rain per year was normal now suffered under 10 inches. By 1919, severe drought gripped all of Montana's farmlands, even as far west as the Flathead and Bitterroot valleys. Farmers had been getting approximately 25 bushels of grain per acre. In 1919, Montana farms averaged only 2.4 bushels per acre. Prairie fires burned houses, barns, granaries, and fields. Swarms of locusts ate up everything green in sight. Horses and cattle starved. More died of blackleg and distemper, livestock diseases. When their livestock died, farmers lost major investments, dairy and meat products, and the horsepower to work their fields. On the reservations, the drought drove relatively successful farmers back into poverty. The people sold vegetables, wheat, and anything to get a little money to buy food or clothing for their families, said Leo Wing Sr., an Assiniboine on the Fort Belknap Reservation. Some of the people lived off sage hens or rabbits or deer. That was about all we could get. Homesteaders plowing the prairie had loosened and dried out the topsoil. Now the topsoil just blew away in giant dust storms. The so-called dryland farming techniques that had been successful during the wet years had created a disaster. 1918, a year of disasters. In 1918, an influenza epidemic,
rapid spread of disease,
swept around the world. Within 9 months, the epidemic killed 675,000 Americans and up to 100 million people worldwide. Unlike most viruses, it killed the young and the strong, mostly people between the ages of 20 and 40. Sometimes whole families died. In some cities, hundreds of orphans wandered the streets to find food. It was later called the worst epidemic the United States has ever known. Because homesteaders were mostly young, the flu hit Montana particularly hard. Many became ill, and approximately 5,000 died. Loretta Gerusi of Bear Creek in Carbon County recalled young, healthy people stopping by to visit, only to be reported dead 2 days later. "My mother was very friendly," Gerusi said. "So when anybody passed by, she always visited with them. And maybe a week later they'd say so-and-so died, and they had been past our place. So many people had that flu, and young people, and they died." Then, in November 1918, World War I ended. The military no longer needed Montana wheat for the war effort. Prices collapsed as the nation's markets flooded with wheat, grain, and produce. Farmers who had gone into debt to support the war effort now could not make their bank payments. Homesteaders who had prided themselves on their grit,
determination,
and adaptability felt helpless against the onslaught. What hope could they hold against the wind, sun, locusts, and disease? As one deeply disappointed homesteader named William Alexander wrote in his diary, people are just walking around to save funeral expenses. Hardship spreads across Montana. Between 1921 and 1925, half the farmers in Montana lost their farms. Of the 82,000 immigrants who came to Montana to homestead, 70,000 left before 1925. Families lined the railroad tracks with their few possessions or moved to other towns in wagons and Model T Fords. Schools closed. Shops went bankrupt. Farm towns folded up. Banks foreclosed.
Took possession of property for failure to repay loans.
On farmers who could not make payments. They auctioned the land, animals, equipment, and household items to the highest bidder. Unable to collect on so many loans, 214 Montana banks closed their doors. At that time, there was no government insurance for depositors. When the banks closed, people lost their life savings. The new counties created during the homesteading boom depended on taxes for their budgets. When taxpayers could not pay, counties took their lands. In some places, the county soon owned more land than anyone else. Governor Samuel Stewart did not know what to do. The state was set up to promote and develop new industries, not to provide relief. When asked for help, he simply held his head in his hands. Church groups distributed some food and clothing to farm families. The Salvation Army and the Red Cross did their best, but too many families needed help. The desperate farmers looked for someone to blame for their problems. First, they blamed the federal government for luring them into debt and abandoning them when disaster struck. They blamed the railroads for the false promises about life in the West. They blamed the so-called scientific experts for their dry land techniques that had ruined the soil. Most of all, they blamed James J. Hill, the great Northern Railway tycoon,
a wealthy businessman,
who was an easy target because he had been so vocal, and also because by this time he was dead. Digging in and adapting. Thousands of homesteaders moved away. Some sold what they had and went on to find better opportunities. Others simply opened their fences, abandoned their livestock, and drove away. Montana was the only state in the Union to lose population between 1920 and 1930. It decreased by more than 11,000 people, from 548,889 in 1920 to 537,606 in 1930. Yet many stayed, too. Some went to work in towns, mines, or lumber camps. Others stayed on the farm and held on. They sold what crops they grew, shared equipment, and lived on deer, elk, grouse, and snake meat when they could find it. Overhunting so depleted wildlife, and farms destroyed so much habitat, that by 1920 almost no elk were left in eastern Montana. And the 2 million pronghorn that grazed on Montana's grasslands in the late 1800s had dwindled to just around 5,000. Some people bought their neighbors' farms at foreclosure sales and expanded their holdings. They changed their farming techniques to better suit the dry climate, and in the few good rainfall years, like 1922 or 1928, they once again produced good crops. The general drought lasted from 1917 until 1940. Even though the rest of the nation enjoyed a prosperous time in the 1920s, Montanans suffered through almost continual drought. Wisdom from experience. The homestead period was perhaps the most dramatic example of the boom and bust
sudden economic activity followed by decline
cycle of Montana's economy. Thousands of people came to farm, and almost as many left. Land values skyrocketed and then dropped like a rock. Hundreds of new banks opened and then failed. Many new counties emerged and then lost the tax base to support themselves. Dozens of farm towns appeared and then died. The farmers who stayed in Montana learned to diversify,
make more varied
their crops, instead of relying on just one product. This way they had access to more markets in case prices for one crop dropped or yields were poor. More farmers became farmer-ranchers, combining crops with beef cattle. Farmers began summer fallowing, planting fields without seeding them. It kills weeds while allowing soils to build up fertility and conserve moisture. many started to strip farm, planting crops and fallowing in alternating strips. Strip farming reduced damage to topsoil and kept it from blowing away in hot windstorms. Montana's farmers also learned that 320 acres could not support a family. They expanded their holdings, and as soon as they could afford them, they bought gasoline tractors and other new equipment, multiple bottom plows, harrows, seed drills, tillers, weeders, mowers, combines, and gas-powered farm trucks. With gas-powered equipment, one person could cultivate larger plots of land at a low cost per acre. The disaster years on Montana's homesteads may have brought non-Indian people as close as they ever came to experiencing what American Indians experienced after the coming of white settlers. They suffered poverty and disease on farms that were too small or otherwise unsuitable for making a living. They felt trapped by powers beyond their control, and they survived through inner fortitude,
strength,
and help from their communities. The farmers who stayed learned that, in Montana, extremes are normal. They began to look at the environment more realistically and to learn about its cycles. They survived by doing what human beings have done for thousands of years on the northern plains, adapting to the land.
Expressions of the people. The poetry of Gwendolyn Haste. Gwendolyn Haste moved from Nebraska to Billings with her family in 1915 when she was 25. She discovered a land unlike anything she had ever seen. Her father was editor of a farming magazine, and Gwendolyn, Gwenna to her friends, worked as his editorial assistant. Gwenna lived in a nice house in town and enjoyed the social life of Billings' upper middle class. But she was fascinated by the homesteading life and by the people she met on farms and homesteads. While her father interviewed the men on a farm, Gwenna visited with the women, heard their stories, and learned intimate details about their joys and heartaches. She began writing and publishing poetry about homesteading in Montana. Even though she never lived on a homestead herself, she often portrayed the experience accurately, according to her homesteading friends. One woman told her, "I don't know how you can write those poems when you didn't go through hell with the rest of us." Gwenna responded that she had spent many sleepless nights worrying about the appalling disaster that was striking down those around me. Two of her poems show contrasting views of life on a homestead. Dried Out expresses the sorrow and frustration of leaving a ruined homestead and the dreams that built it, represented by the roses by the door. The second poem, Horizons, gives a glimpse of the joy and richness of life on a Montana farm. Dried Out. This place was the first home we ever had, and I was sick of farming for other folks, first in Wisconsin and then in Dakota. It looked so pretty when he broke sod that day. There were only 3 sides to the house, but what did I care? There was sunlight and wet rain and a coulee, full of springtime where the children could play. 7 full years, says the book, and 7 lean, and we come in at the end of the full ones, I guess. There ain't no crops where they's no rain, and the stock died in the big blizzard. So now we're going back to Dakota to farm for other folks. Oh God, the nice white ranch house with a floor we was to have, the roses by the door. Horizons. I had to laugh, for when she said it, we were sitting by the door, and straight down was the fork, twisting and turning and gleaming in the sun. And then your eyes carried across to the purple bench beyond the river, with the Beartooth Mountains fairly screaming with light and blue and snow, and fold and turn of rim rock and prairie as far as your eye could go. And she says, "Dear Laura, sometimes I feel so sorry for you, shut away from everything, eating out your heart with loneliness. When I think of my own full life, I wish that you could share it. Just pray for happier days to come and bear it." She goes back to Billings, to her white stucco house, and looks through net curtains at another white stucco house, and a brick house, and a yellow frame house, and 6 trimmed poplar trees, and little squares of shaved grass. Oh dear, she stared at me like I was daft. I couldn't help it. I just laughed and laughed.